Tonight's program, here we are, MS Views Now. And this is a program we started at the beginning of COVID, and we were talking about how COVID was affecting multiple sclerosis. But, you know, as we slid out of actually the pandemic, we wanted to keep this name going, and we talk about what is happening in the news now. And then hence we have MS Views Now. So for those that don't know, for those that don't really know, my name is Stuart Schlossman. That is a much younger version of me. I definitely have to change the photograph, or I have to get younger again. We'll see which one is easier to do. All right. I am president and founder of MS Views and News, and I also have multiple sclerosis. Tonight, our guest is Tim Coetzee. He's the Chief Advocacy and Services and Science Officer at the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters for tonight's program. We have Genentech and Sanofi, and we want to give them a virtual round of applause. Thank you for that. All right, so tonight we have, as I stated, we have Dr. Timothy Coetzee, or Tim Coetzee, and Tim Coetzee has 23 years with the National MS Society this month. That is absolutely fantastic. I want to thank you for that. And prior to the MS Society, he was doing multiple sclerosis research. We're not going to talk about that tonight, but we do know that we are speaking with somebody that definitely has the credentials to be in this role. All right. So
thank you, Stuart. Great to be with you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for that. Can you please share with our audience your exact role with the MS Society?
Certainly. So again, great to be with your audience and those people who might be watching after this show is recorded. That picture you see up there, like Stuart's, is a much younger me, much younger me. But as Stuart said, I have a privilege of being the Chief Advocacy Services and Science Officer at the National MS Society. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I can break it down. What that basically means is I am responsible for providing leadership to our programs that advocate for people affected by MS, that engage healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, other health professionals, and also disseminating all the information you would see on our website about what is MS, what are the treatments, all of that health information, things like, you know, when people should take the COVID vaccine and the like. I'm also responsible for our services, which includes our MS Navigator program and all the educational programs that are produced through our MS Navigator team. I'm responsible for the marketing department. That's not in my title. It would just make it too long. And also I'm responsible for the scientific programs at the National MS Society, which is basically our research that we fund, as well as the international work we do with MS societies from around the world that are focused on MS research. And basically my job is to integrate all of that, make sure those teams are all talking to each other, and also join shows like yours to talk about the amazing work that's happening around the world in MS research, as well as lots of other things that we're doing to change the journey of MS.
Thank you very much. Well, that is exactly the reason why I asked you to be on here tonight, why we asked you to be on here. It seems like once every 6 months, because there is so much change that does happen every 6 months that, you know, I have to ask what I consider, or who I consider, like one of the best to be here. So you're my Yankees team. So there you go.
Well, there you go. Well, I'm glad you use the Yankees because I'm a diehard, long time Yankees fan. So although this year it's been a hard season this year, but you know,
yeah, they're terrible this year. So
there's always next year.
Exactly. Let's talk about Pathways to Cures, and I want to bring this up because you all invited me to that conference that you did back in March. It was phenomenal. I would love to be part of that again. If you do it again next year, I would love to be part of that. I would love to be part of whatever's happening, where some of the researchers that were there, that they're talking all their research dialogue, which was hard at times for me to follow. But at the same time, when I was asking questions and I'm speaking as the true layman, they didn't understand what I was talking about. And so, you know, one of them still writes with me, and and it's just interesting to know or not know, you know, what's really going on out there and what they do or don't know of what's actually happening within the MS community. So how do we make it more available to the researchers, especially in the United States, as to what patients are seeking more of?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So why don't I can unpack that for you. And first, I'll start with what we're talking about with Pathways to Cures. For there's people in your audience who may not know what
Sure.
that is, and then also how we're working with the scientific community and what you're getting at, which is how do we ensure that you, as an expert in living with MS, can share your expertise with the scientific experts and vice versa. So just to back up, the audience is seeing this visual about what we call Pathways to Cures. This is a bold vision that the National MS Society catalyzed, but that now has global engagement. And the idea behind this goes back to when the society adopted a new mission statement that said, "We will cure MS while empowering people affected by MS to live their best lives." We've had that mission statement now about 4 years, and what was revolutionary about that mission statement is that we actually put into it the beginning phrase that said, "We will cure MS." And we had not used that language in our mission statement in other places because we had wondered about, would people feel that we're going too far? But we heard from people affected by MS, as we were going through our strategic planning process, that said, you're not talking about cure. An organization like yours has to declare that you're for a cure. If you're not declaring that for a cure, how we're not being very ambitious. And the scientists, on the other hand, said, well, if we say cure and we can't deliver it within a certain time frame, we're failing. And what we ultimately decided is that we have to be ambitious enough to declare that we're going to go for a cure and do everything we can, recognizing this is really hard, but also mobilize the community. And that really came from people affected by MS saying, we've got to be more ambitious with how we talk about how we're going to create a world free of MS. That's where we got that that was the genesis of this. And then when we started thinking about, well, how do we get to that? We said, well, we need to have an international consensus on what it means to find cures for MS. Because the National MS Society can't just go out and say, okay, we're going to cure the disease, and so we're going to own it. MS is a global problem, and we need an international consensus around how to get there. And so we got scientists together, we had people affected by MS engaged to really help us understand, if we were going to find a cure for MS, what would be the paths that we would get there and get an international consensus. What you see on the screen is where we arrived at, that we would have 3 pillars to the strategy. And we use cures in a plural because we also have heard from people affected by MS that cures mean different things to different people depending on where they are in their MS journey. And so if you're early in the disease and have just been with MS, a cure there is stopping the disease cold in its tracks, so you never have to worry about it, so that you can stop the disease before symptoms show up. Better, to employ lifestyle strategies to manage progression and really get very precise medicine. And the goal being no more disease progression. If you've been living with MS for some time and lost function, cure, again, we heard from people living with MS said, restoring what I've lost would be a cure for me. And so that would be things like myelin repair, rehabilitation, lifestyle and wellness. Regaining lost function and getting back into society would be a cure. And then for those who don't live with MS, or let's say a person lives with MS, but they have grandkids, their hope would be that we end the disease and we never have MS again, prevent it, either by identifying who's at risk and getting in front, giving guidance to those who are most at risk. And that's where our concept of no new diagnoses. And so we've created these 3 pathways to cures, and now we're organizing our research strategies around all of this. We've got 20, I think we're up to 30 international organizations, including MS News and Views, endorsed the Pathways to Cures after it was published. And we've gone even one step further. Of the major MS organizations that fund research are now coordinating our research strategy so that we're not duplicating effort. We're working together more closely than we ever have before to be able to cure MS faster. So that's the whole genesis. And all along the way, people affected by MS have been engaged in giving us input, reviewing the plan. The conference that you talked about, our first global summit, brought 200 people from around the world, 15 countries, researchers, people affected by MS. And we had people from South America, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Europe, lots of different countries, all sort of rallying around this. So it was a pivotal moment in the MS movement, and I'm glad you were able to be part of it and to continue to be part of it.
So, Dr. Coetzee, continuing, first off, how many different societies were at this conference?
So I'm trying to remember. I would say there was at least 10 different MS organizations. We had Australia, United Kingdom. We had, the MS News and Views. We had our friends from the Italian MS Society, the United Arab Emirates MS Society. So quite a few were there. I think that was the number off the top of my head as I go around the room to try to remember who all was there. But it was. We're excited about this because, the National MS Society is the oldest of the MS organizations, having been now, I think, 77 years since Silvia Lari founded the organization. But and we've always worked closely with our international partners because Silvia Lari believed from the very beginning, when we funded our first grant in 1946, that she believed we go wherever we need to go to find the solutions for MS. If they're in the United States, great, but let's go where the experts are, and we take that to this day, which is why we have so much international presence.
Sure, thank you for that. And how many different researchers were there? And start with that.
I believe there are about 150 researchers. And then the rest were MS organizations, people affected by MS. We had some of our national board there. And so the researchers were a mix of researchers from across the different disciplines, but also young researchers, mid-career researchers, senior researchers. We had a range of people there because, we believe that it's important that we have as many voices. And sometimes those younger voices see things that, individuals who have been at organizations for 23 years, like me, might miss. And so that's, we try to keep it as vibrant as we can because, cross-fertilization of people and ideas really makes a difference.
Right. Speaking of which, so with all the different researchers there, were there any that were more towards one project than another?
No, actually, so that's interesting that you say that. We tried to balance it so that we captured all parts of the agenda: the stopping progression, restoring function, regaining what's been lost. I think, in each of the areas we heard really, I think, cutting edge science that helped us understand what we need to do to get a more precise way of treating MS, what we call precision medicine, which, in other diseases like cancer, you're starting to see very specific use of this drug to treat this cancer at this stage. We're not quite to that place in MS that you can say, okay, let's take this treatment at this time because we know these cells are involved in causing lesions, but we're going to try this treatment then after that as a way to try to get remyelination to happen. We're not at that, what we call precision medicine stage yet, but that's the future. And so we heard from researchers who are working on that. We heard from people working on, like, what are the genetics and what are the risk factors of MS. I was particularly excited about some of the sessions that were focused on restoring what's been lost.
Right.
And, with restoring what's been lost, we often talk about remyelination and myelin repair. That's what I did my fellowship work and my research and as an MS researcher. And of course, I'm super excited about that. I could talk about that all day. But the other aspect of it, though, was how we use things like rehabilitation in order to, get people more active, moving, restoring, and regaining function through rehab and some of that physical medicine and things that people with MS can do today to restore function and regain function that way. I think that's a really emerging area that allows individuals, when we can implement that, it'll allow people to do things at home in between doctor's visits that may not necessarily involve taking a pill, but that can actually empower people to live well and also preserve function as long as they can if they have progressive MS. So that all of those areas are the positives. The research, the conference also highlighted some of the challenges. You flagged it as sort of the issue of sharing data when people participate in clinical trials. Why is it that data can't move back and forth? And you brought that forward, saying, as a patient, I'm happy to have my data shared. What do we need to do to break those barriers down? And we're actually starting to work on that. Some of it, I'll say, has to do with how the researchers are handling the data and maybe hoarding the data a little bit. There's challenges like governments and government laws. Like there are, because many governments, particularly in other parts of the world that perhaps don't have as many resources, prohibit actually the data from leaving their country because they don't want their citizens to be exploited, because that has happened. And so there are some parts of the world where, like, I was talking to one researcher who was at Pathways. I saw him last week, and he said, I'm working with a colleague in a country in Africa. Their government will not allow the person there to share information with me over there, just because, again, they don't want their people exploited. So I think those are things we're going to try to tackle.
So a question. So first off, thank you for remembering that I brought that topic up. That was I thought that was the key of my entire weekend there.
It was great. We're so glad you did.
Thank you. Isn't there a way to open up a cloud where research can go into this cloud, so that way it's protected, by the research organizations from around the world and organizations such as the National MS Society, so that way the research can be shared in a cloud?
Yeah. We're trying to do that. I think the challenge is more and more governments, and really this comes down to is it's less about the researchers wanting to share, Stuart, and more about governments, sovereignty issues coming into play. That really the governments are kind of like, no, we're not going to do that. There's one country in Europe, I will not name it because I don't want to create issues for anyone from that country, where basically all of the data becomes the property of that country, and so then it's prohibited from leaving. The good news is, here's what I will share, is that people have identified this problem, and there actually is innovation happening. I've been in conversation with someone who are coming up with ways to do exactly what you're doing, which is, can we create a cloud, where the data doesn't leave the country, but researchers, say in Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, can look at data that a researcher might have in Zambia, and it doesn't have to leave Zambia, but they can actually share information and talk to each other. And that's how things actually work in the consumer sector, where all of the data in your phone, depending on what your service provider is, doesn't leave your phone. But if you use Apple, for example, Siri, which is learning from when I use it, even though my data is not leaving my phone. So we actually have places where this has worked, and so we're actually in conversation to see, can we try to crack this nut. It's I see both sides. On the one hand, you don't want people's data to be exploited. You don't want privacy to be lost. Right? There's a lot of important reasons to protect privacy. At the same time, we need to make sure that voices like yours of patients who are saying, share my data so that it can be used to help others, please, let's do that. And so I think we're working through it. It's going to take some heavy lifting, but we're committed to doing that heavy lift.
Sure, thank you. So let me first off, thank you for everything you just said, because you killed off some of my questions while you were speaking, all right?
I'm trying to get past those 3 pages so that we can get to the audience.
It's fine. But I'm still stuck in the first paragraph here with the first 3 questions. And that is, can you please define to the audience what it means to the National Multiple Sclerosis Society to have no more disease activity?
Yeah. So basically what that would mean is creating a future where when a person, let's do it from 2 points of view. The first future would be, we know that we estimate roughly 25 to 30,000 people are diagnosed with MS in the United States each year. So that's people with new diagnosis. They they're part of the million, but and today probably somebody was told you have multiple sclerosis. No new disease activity would mean that they start a treatment, whatever treatment it is, that's safe, effective, that can take over time. That means they no longer have any new disease activity, no lesions, no disease progression. Stopping it in its tracks and making MS a small part of their life. They'll still have MS, but if we can stop disease activity, so there's nothing you can detect. You can't detect it. You can't detect anything using Octave's test that you discussed below. You don't see anything on MRI, and they don't exhibit any progression. That would be the future. We're not there yet. I will say that. I'll recognize that. We've come a long way since the first disease-modifying treatment that was approved in 1993. So it's 30 years. So we're in a big, different world today than we were in 1993 with all of our new treatments. But even with all of these new treatments, people still have disease activity. So we want to stop it in its tracks. Now, for the person who perhaps has been living with MS for, say, 5 or 6 years and is having activity, our goal for there as well is treatments that halt it, just stop it dead in its tracks. And then what we can focus on is applying the restore treatments to be able to get back what they may have lost over those 5 years. So that's what we're going for, Stuart. It's a ambitious, high goal. I'm confident that with all the progress we've made over the last 30 years with DMTs, we can get there. But that's what we're going for.
Thank you. Can you tell me how many research studies are happening in the United States on the restore, like on myelin repair?
Yeah. Well, give me a second. As you think about those questions, I can give you a really hot off the press answer.
Great. Well, part of that, though, is what kind of myelin research is happening?
Yeah. So why don't we start there while I try to multitask and because I just got those numbers. I actually, it's pretty exciting. We're doing this global strategy to try to understand all that's happening in terms of research around the world. So I can get that to you in a second. So, but let's go back to the type of myelin repair research that's happening. So one of the things first off to say is, so I will say that when I started in MS research about a long time ago, should I say, I was even younger than the picture that you showed. Nobody, and I will say this honestly to your audience, not overstating. The first MS conference I went to as a myelin researcher, if somebody at that meeting in 1994 had said, we've come up with this way that the brain can repair itself, remyelination can happen in the brain, people would have been laughed out. There was just no belief that the brain could repair itself in that way. Today, fast forward, and even then, 10 years later at a conference, when people ask, can we do clinical trials of myelin repair therapies? The answer was no. We don't know what to measure. We don't have the treatments. It was a lot. All of that prompted the National MS Society to then begin sort of an initiative we call Promise 2010, which was about finding treatments to repair myelin. So what's happening now is that there is research that's going on to discover what would be required to promote myelin within the brain. We've been involved in research looking at stem cells that are present in the brain. You and I have stem cells in our brain that are able to repair our brain today. But what we also are learning from that research is that as we get older, those stem cells, which we have, whether you're 80 or 40 years old, as I know you are, it doesn't, as you get older to 80, those stem cells don't repair as well as when you're 40 or when you're 20, they're even better. And so Robin Franklin is trying to figure out, can you rejuvenate those stem cells? Because if you have them, can you coax them into forming myelin repair? We've also been involved with work like that Jonah Chan and Ari Green have done out in the University of California, San Francisco, trying to identify molecules that can promote myelin repair. They've been involved in trials looking at that. There's multiple trials happening now of myelin repair treatments. And so what's exciting for your audience is that that one, myelin repair research is happening. Two, we're finding that the brain can repair itself, and we've gone beyond just sort of the idea that you can repair myelin in mice. We're actually doing it in people. There's been clinical trials in people. There have been some disappointments, and some of the treatments haven't worked, but there's also been others that are very promising. So I am excited by what we can do. What I can tell you is that right now, internationally, I don't quite have the number in the United States, so I could break it down, but I can tell you that internationally, there's more than 200 projects involved in the restore area. Many of those are involved in different aspects of myelin repair, and some of them are also in the areas of rehabilitation. So it's an active area. It's really changed a lot over the last 10 years.
Right. Thank you. So going back to what I said earlier, though, about the sharing of data, we don't know if Zimbabwe has the beginning and somebody in Germany has the end, and it needs to just be put together and boom, it's done. How does that work?
How does that work? So that's where, when I mentioned about the work of the Pathways meeting, so this is the work we're doing now. So as a result of Pathways, the MS organizations from Australia, Canada, the United States, Italy, UK, us, along with the MS International Federation, which is an umbrella that links up all the MS organizations. In addition, we have Spain, Germany, I think we have Belgium in that mix, Netherlands. We all fund research. And so what we've said is, let's actually pool all of our research that says, what projects are we funding? Let's all find out what projects are we funding. Let's bucket them by stop, restore, and end. And then that'll give us a sense of how much science are we funding, how much money is being invested, which is more than, I think it's hundreds of millions, and then in what areas are they? And so that gets to your question, Stuart, is we wanted to understand what's the landscape of what patient organizations are doing. We're moving now into what governments are doing. And the goal is that we can look across this portfolio and say, okay, who's working on end, who's working on stop? Can we bring some of these together? And then what we're going to do is actually start coordinating our strategies in a way that that's never been done before. That's one of the incredible aspects that Pathways to Cures has been able to generate, is it's created this place where we all are committed to understanding and working together. The other thing too is I'll say is that what this has done is, you have me, the National MS Society has staff researchers like myself, all of the others do. And so I'm talking to my counterparts, they're talking to us, and we oftentimes will say, we'll talk to each other about projects that we might be able to jointly fund together, and that way we help each other out. So I see a question from someone around NerveGen.
You've seen the questions. Oh my gosh, how are you seeing the questions? That's great.
Something came in from the chat, NerveGen 291. I have to say, I'm not sure about that agent. I will find out and try to find out about that one.
Okay. And then there's a person asking, I'm a little confused about that, but a person is asking about what's going on between ECTRAMS and Pathways and how do they compare? And I don't know if that's something that you can answer.
Oh, absolutely. So ECTRAMS is, for those who may not know what ECTRAMS is, it's a large MS professional organization. So it brings together the professionals working, scientists, researchers, clinicians working in MS worldwide. It's the oldest of what we call our TRIMS organizations. It stands for the European Committee for Treatments and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. ECTRAMS is a partner with the National MS Society actually on several things. They endorsed Pathways, and then they also partner with us in sponsoring an international committee called the Clinical Trials Committee, or the International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS, I think is a formal name. But what this committee does is they work on things like the diagnostic criteria for MS, how we describe MS, the descriptors of relapsing MS, progressive MS, that kind of thing. They also provide advice on how do we conduct clinical trials? How should we consider things like comorbidities, when we have hypertension and different issues in MS. And so we work closely with ECTRAMS on that, and we're partnering with them on those and other areas. So we are mutually, we're collaborators in this work.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so somebody else is asking, before we get back to my questions, is restoring myelin a possibility in advanced MS?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the aspects that we have to figure out in advanced MS is that, what we see in advanced MS is that both myelin is lost, but also nerve cells are lost, because once myelin is stripped away from nerve cells, nerves start going into a bit of a crisis mode and then ultimately die, and that's what causes loss of brain cells. And so to remyelinate a nerve cell, you have to have a nerve cell there. And so some of what we're thinking about is there's a strategy called neuroprotection, which is using drug treatments or other ways to create a more favorable environment so that nerve cells survive while they're trying to get remyelination back. We've actually been involved with a clinical trial with the UK MS Society, looking at whether or not a cholesterol-lowering drug called simvastatin. Some people, you might recognize that it's called Zocor. Zocor has been around for a while. Most people don't take it for cholesterol anymore. But some of the research found that people taking Zocor with progressive MS who took Zocor actually had less brain atrophy, which means they were losing fewer brain cells compared to people who didn't take it. And so now we're involved with the UK MS Society in a large phase 3 clinical trial to see if Zocor could be a protective agent and preserve the brain. And by preserving brain cells, that keeps them in place to be able to remyelinate. So that's the challenge we have with advanced MS, is we've got to make sure that we can preserve those nerve cells.
Great, thank you for that. So going forward let's talk about advanced. What do we have in research happening for primary progressive MS?
Right, so that's a good question. So this is where the International Progressive MS Alliance comes into play. We've had, the Alliance has been in existence now for about 10 years, and we've been focused on a couple of things. One is trying to understand what's happening in progressive MS so that we see, is the biology of progressive MS, how is the biology of progressive MS different from relapsing MS? So we funded research into that. We've been funding work for example, at Dr. Francisco Quintana at Harvard, who has found that some of the cells that are involved in damaging the brain in progressive MS are different from those involved in relapsing MS. And he's now identified a couple of drug compounds that are now going through the next phases of testing to be able to show that the mechanisms that cause damage in progressive MS are different than they are in relapsing disease, and we're targeting them. And hopefully within the next couple of years, he'll be able to start clinical trials of that. We're also working with other researchers on what we call a rehabilitation pipeline, because we know that with progressive MS, being able to give people other interventions like rehab could really improve quality of life. And so we're focused on that area of research as well. There also has been research that the Canadian MS Society funded, which looked at a clinical trial of either exercise or cognitive behavioral therapy as ways to improve fatigue in people with primary progressive MS. And the results of that trial will be coming out in the next few weeks. So we're fingers crossed, going to see positive results from that. The good news, I'd say, for the audience is that there's a lot more progressive MS research happening today than there was 10 years ago. There's hundreds of projects involved in that, and that we're chipping away at understanding what's different about progressive MS relative to relapsing MS.
Thank you. Is there a list anywhere where patients can go to see where there are open studies happening, where they can contact and possibly join the study?
Absolutely. So if you go to the National MS Society website and you click on the research section, and then there'll be a a tab, a link that will say, studies that are recruiting, and there you can see clinical trials, different surveys, different things that, people can participate in. Everything that we list has been vetted by our staff to make sure that it's a up and up study, that, it's, well qualified, that the researchers are good researchers doing that work. So I would recommend people do that. You can see that there.
Great. Now let's talk about secondary progressive.
Mm-hmm.
What do we have happening for secondary progressive MS studies, since it seems to be that that's the lingering one that's behind the others?
Yeah, no, so that there again in the Progressive MS Alliance, we're working through that. Within secondary progressive MS, your audience might recall that there's what we call active and inactive secondary progressive MS, which is a bit of a misnomer, because someone with secondary progressive MS has disease that's active, it's going on. It's just that when you have active secondary progressive MS, the doctors are able to see using MRI or some other measures that something's going on in the brain. And so there are actually clinical trials now looking at testing some treatments in what we call inactive secondary progressive MS, or progressive MS where there's no relapses happening. And so some of the new BTK inhibitors are being tested in that. These are new drugs that target B cells. And so I think there's movement there. Also within the Progressive MS Alliance, the work that, Dr. Quintana, Dr. Martino, and some of our other projects, which are looking at trying to tease out what's different about the secondary progressive MS population against, say, primary or relapsing. Some of the doctors have been studying, can we see what's contributing to the disease biology? What we're learning is that there's definitely ongoing disease activity. There are different cells within the nervous system that seem to be involved. There are these cells called microglia, which normally have the role of being the I call them the street sweepers of the brain. Their job is to clear out, stuff and get rid of it. They play a very important role in keeping our brain, keeping the streets of our brain clean. But during inflammation, they also get turned the other way. And so when they start seeing damage, they get activated, they get hyperactive, and they start then damaging nerve cells. And that's some of what we are seeing in secondary progressive MS. And those are the cells that Dr. Quintana's work is targeting, and others who are working on that. So that's new science. It's emerging. We've got more to learn about that, but I think that it's pointing the way to how we can solve the secondary progressive MS nut.
Great. Thank you for that answer. All right, we're going to jump around a little bit. So
Okay.
another one that's here now that a couple of people have asked about is, are they able to use just strictly nutrition and exercise and forego on DMTs and hope to that their bodies will not worsen?
Yeah, important question. So first off, diet and exercise, super important. I would not discourage anybody from that. I think diet and exercise is both good for just general health, but the more you can do that, the more preserving function, the better. I think the data around disease modifying treatments also tells us that starting a disease modifying treatment has effects over decades, and the sense is that the data that we're learning from people who've been studied over the 30 years now that we've had disease modifying treatments is that people who started DMT early compared to those who didn't start a DMT have better long-term outcomes, we call it, in terms of how they progress in disability, how they progress in terms of overall progression. And so, again, I want to stipulate I'm not a physician, so obviously if you have questions around this, really super important to talk to your neurologist and your healthcare provider and the important people in your life around that. The data and the long-term clinical studies do tell us that starting a disease-modifying treatment can really make a difference. Particularly what we see is 10 and 20 years out. That preserving brain function and preventing damage early on in the disease has long-term benefit many, many decades after perhaps the person is diagnosed. I think the other thing to consider is that, the disease-modifying treatments we have today and some of the higher efficacy ones don't have some of the side effects that the earlier generation have. And so, I think, I would encourage an individual to think about, the disease-modifying treatments as one of the tools in maintaining optimum brain health. Exercise and diet is a contributor to brain health, but also disease-modifying treatment is obviously an important component of that. And I would definitely encourage you, don't think necessarily just in terms of the short term, but really consider the long term, because the data is quite strong that long-term benefits are there.
So I attest to that because I'm 25 years in this year, and since diagnosis, and yeah, I've been on the medicines. I was on the injections. I was on the Avanexes, the Rebifs, the Betaseron, the Copaxone, and built my way up to just being where I am these days, which is just a high efficacy drug. So let me go back to some of the questions online, and then we'll go back to some more of mine. Person wants to know what's being studied for fatigue. Anything specific?
Yeah. So the clinical trial that I just mentioned, they called it COGX, was actually looking at the impact of, like I said, cognitive behavioral therapy or exercise on fatigue. So that was our first large-scale study, a well-designed clinical trial looking at that question. So I understand that research is going to be published in the next few weeks, and keep your eye on the National MS Society website to be able to see what that research told us. I'm fingers crossed that it'll tell us that it can benefit fatigue. Other studies have told us that exercise is beneficial for fatigue, and obviously, one has to balance that. Exercise in and of itself is a fatiguing thing, but being able to create that reserve really makes a difference. And so a lot of the research around fatigue is around what are the interventions one can do to try to manage fatigue. So there is quite a bit of research. A lot of it centers on exercise, I'll say, and part of what we're trying to figure out is, are there other ways, other aspects of fatigue that we can understand that can help us get at that question. But it is, I would say, that fatigue, pain, and cognition are the top three symptoms we often hear people asking, like, what's the research that we can do around those?
Thank you. All right, so in with what you were just saying, a person is asking if exercise and diet can help prevent relapse or disease progression. If we have disease breakthrough, new minor spots on MRI, does that indicate that our diet/exercise probably has not been sufficient?
Yeah, so I would say no. I wouldn't go there. The challenge of MS is it's a wily disease, and it sort of, it can come at you from different angles, and that there are still aspects of the disease that we don't understand, that may not be fully handled with the disease modifying treatment. So I think that, like I said, I would view diet, exercise, and the disease modifying treatments, as well as other behaviors like mindfulness and other things, as all part of they're all tools that you can use to manage the disease and to keep up the diet and the exercise. And that if there's breakthrough disease, to have a conversation with your doctor about what are some of the other options that we can have.
Okay, thank you. Next, let's talk let's talk a little bit about like the interview that I was doing last night, or the program/interview that I did last night with Octave BioSciences. And can you tell the audience, please, what you feel about the blood biomarker that they have, and is it foolproof, or will there be some that it just may read one way and it actually is something else?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, Octave BioSciences, I think that's their name. It's a company from California that's working on developing, a blood test that doctors can ask to, to give to a person to give an indication of what's happening in their disease. And I will say, first off, I am really glad that companies like Octave are coming into the MS space to be able to build on what we've learned, apply their technology, and get those blood tests that we have needed for MS for years. We have not had something like this in MS, and we do need these convenient tests that, just like when you go see a doctor and they prescribe some for you to go out and get lab tests to get your cholesterol level measured and everything under the sun. We need that in MS so that they can monitor that over time to be able to predict what's going up, what's going down. In Octave's test, they have 18 different molecules that they're measuring in the blood to try to give them a sense for as predictors of disease activity. Just like cholesterol, for example, cholesterol levels high cholesterol could predict that you could potentially have heart disease, and too low cholesterol also is not a good thing, that you want to try to be in the middle. What we're going for, and what Octave is going for with their test, is to be able to use a series of markers to predict this is telling us that there is certain disease activity. The main biomarker, as we call this, in their test that I think is a big driver that your audience may hear about is a molecule called neurofilament light chain, NFL for short. And NFL, as it's called, is a molecule that's very specific to nerve cells. It is what I would describe as the NFL is kind of like the 2x4s of a house. If you think about the nerve cell as a house, NFL, you would have all these studs and 2x4s that keep the walls up of your house. Well, that's actually what NFL is doing. It's creating the structure of a nerve cell, and then when nerve cells die, this molecule gets into the person's spinal fluid, and then from the spinal fluid into the blood, and so NFL levels in a person's blood are indicative of nerve cell damage. And what they're learning in MS is that some of the science tells us that as a person is going through relapses and having disease activity, NFL levels go up, and so then it might tell the doctor that the DMT is not working, and we need to look at maybe making a change. The data is strongest with NFL around highly active disease and relapsing MS. It's less persuasive when it comes to predicting progressive MS. Part of that is is complicated by the fact that as we get older, our brains have more nerve cells are dying, so there's more NFL in the bloodstream, and so we're a little. It's not necessarily as useful in progressive MS, but that's what Octave is going for, and I do think that it's what they're pioneering is really trying to create those blood tests. So it's an exciting future, and obviously we're excited to see them publish their data and get it out there and start using it so that it can become perhaps a test that doctors use routinely.
All right. What do we say? Thank you for that. But what do we say to the people that they might have had the test and they were told that they were midline, and that a few months went by and all of a sudden they're having a relapse?
Yeah.
They tested low for any potential worsening.
Exactly. So I think that's one of the things to think about with tests like this, and the fact that MS is what I would describe as an episodic disease. And so one of the challenges is that if the test is taken when the disease activity is low, but then you have a trigger or something happens, so it could come back midline, and then 3 months, because of the unpredictability of MS, a person has a relapse, then the disease activity would be high. And so it is not, I would say, any test, this is not going to be a one and done. It has to be done over time. And so, midline results today are not necessarily predictive that the person's never going to have a relapse. I don't think the company would say that it could be predictive of that. They would probably do a test again to say, okay, this says that perhaps a person's DMT isn't working. Now let's try a different one, would be probably how we're thinking about it. And really, it's not meant to be, a test that says, okay, you're good, you're stable, nothing's going to happen. It's really more meant to give a sense for over time, how is the MS progressing?
Thank you. Do you know if what the costs are involved with that, or if there's insurance being taken, or who's paying for it?
Good question. I know the company is working with insurance providers to be able to try to make sure that they get the coverage around that. I will say I have not had a recent conversation with the company about the cost of the treatment, so I'm afraid I don't know that.
We actually had that in the dialogue last night, but I don't recall, and somebody's asking that question, so I thought maybe you would bring it up. But KE, I know who I'm talking about. Just tomorrow we'll be publishing last night's program, so you can listen to that and you'll get the information about this. All right, another
And
person
again,
is
I'm sorry
asked.
I don't have that.
Well, it's new news. I mean, how
Yeah.
would you know, right? Okay. So what is being studied in neuroimmunology in MS treatments?
Hmm. Good question. So, part of the neuroimmunology, so a number of the clinical trials that we're doing now with this treatment called Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitor, BTKI as it's called, are really getting at the neuroimmune. So those are the new treatments that are targeting B cells. And so that's one aspect of neuroimmune that we're going for. The work that I referenced from Dr. Quintana that's looking at these other immune cells of the nervous system called microglia, they're also targeting that. And so those are some of the targets that we're looking at in terms of the neuroimmune aspects of it. We're also looking at, when we talk about cells, immune cells in the nervous system, that's where the neuroimmune comes in. We know, for example, that B cells get into the spinal fluid, and having B cells running around your brain and your nervous system isn't a good thing. And so part of the excitement around some of the BTK inhibitors is that they actually get into the nervous system. And so you're going to be able to get in there and stop those B cells that are causing what we call neuroimmune challenges. And so that's part of the research that people are going for, is really starting to understand what are the immune actors in the brain. The microglia are there, B cells are there. There's these other cells in the brain called astrocytes. They're actually what make the gray matter of your brain gray, and they actually are also supporting the nerve cells. And in MS, they get a bit angry at what's happening and cause inflammation on themselves. And so all of those are targets for both understanding what's the biology going on with these cells, but then more importantly, scientists like me, we could study everything to death, but the idea is, you study it enough so that you get the targets, and then you can start developing treatments. Because at the end of the day, we got to help people with MS. We can study till we're blue in the face, but at some point you got to stop studying and you've got to start treating.
Thank you for that. All right, let's go back to the stem cell research. You were saying before about the aging and how things are different. So if and when things get more developed with stem cells being deployed in the United States in people with multiple sclerosis, will they take the stem cells for a person my age from a person my age, or will that have to, or if they inject somebody half my age, am I going to feel younger again?
Good question. So a lot of the stem cell research that I mentioned earlier was less about taking stem cells out of somebody else and putting them into you, and actually rejuvenating and stimulating the cells that are within you now to basically behave like younger stem cells. And so that's the research that Robin Franklin and others are doing, is taking drugs like metformin and other things to basically trick the stem cells that are perhaps not so ready to remyelinate. And there are other strategies like that where the idea is, rather than putting external stem cells into you, let's get the stem cells you've already got in you doing their job. Because we're all walking around with lots of stem cells. That's the challenges that we found from the research, is particularly in the brain, those stem cells sit there and do nothing. But fortunately, they've been able to find that there are ways to coax them to try to behave like they're younger. Now, there is research being done in some clinical trials looking at what we call mesenchymal stem cells. Those are stem cells taken out of the bone marrow that could then be programmed to look like their nerve cells, and then putting them back into the spinal fluid of people with progressive MS specifically. There's been research that's being done on that area at the Tisch MS Center. There's a couple of companies that have been working at this. The the general thinking is that what's happening there is those stem cells aren't so much going and sort of creating new myelin, but probably more likely putting out molecules, acting a bit like factories and pumping out molecules that stimulate existing stem cells to myelinate and repair. There hasn't been a lot of research of late taking external stem cells and putting them into people for the purpose of creating new myelin. That kind of stem cell therapy. I think part of what some of the barriers and what we've learned is that those stem cells need to have a target and need to know where to go, and it's not certain that they would actually know where they're going. And so I think that more likely, I would say over time, trying to find ways to get the stem cells that reside within us to do their job is going to be the focus.
Okay, great. So how much, going back to all this myelin, how much is being shared from, I know it's hard to share, but how much is being shared in the United States with other research centers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a good example of that is our project in the Progressive MS Alliance, where we're working with Dr. Gianvito Martino, who he's in Italy. He's the lead. His whole project is focused around remyelination, and he's got 13 researchers that are part of his team. Several of them from the United States, some from Canada, a number from Europe, and some from Israel. And so, they're working quite collaboratively internationally, and many of the myelin repair researchers today, Stuart, are all working as international multidisciplinary teams because they, in the Martino Labs teams, for example, a team in San Francisco is trying to use AI and big data approaches to identify what are the molecules that could be used that he could then test in Italy. And then you got folks in Canada and Europe and France who are looking at how can we understand, what's happening in people around this. So collaboration is a big theme these days, I would say, and definitely a lot of data sharing happening that way.
Great, thank you for that. Let's talk about AI. Let's talk about Icometrics. What do they have to offer? And can you tell everybody about that, please?
Yeah, so Icometrics is a company. A full disclosure, I've interacted quite a lot with Icometrics. I serve on one of their advisory boards, uncompensated. So everything I'm saying, there's no exchange. Pretty much, they ask me for my perspective, and I give it to them, and it's free of charge. So just let your viewers know that so they're a company that develops software to help doctors understand, radiologists to understand images and to analyze images in AI. So AI, I think artificial intelligence is incredibly powerful. And I think the ability of what we call large language models to be able to become a tool where a doctor could say, take an image, let's say you go out, you have an MRI, and your doctor looks at that image. Ideally in the future, what you'd want to be able to do is to have an AI algorithm that could analyze that and pick up what the doctor may not see, which is already in practice. I mean, for your audience to know is that there's already work going on. We're using CT scanners. They're able to use AI that doctors can spot things that might be indicative of a stroke that get missed in an emergency room. And that because humans are limited, and so the AI is there. The key thing is we need to be able to gather the data from tens of thousands of people living with MS to be able to have enough big data to teach the algorithm what it should be looking for as it tries to predict what may be happening in a person in the future. Now, the good news is, so Icometrics is contributing to that. Their platform lets people analyze imaging samples. They're working with lots of centers, and they recently took a big step where they were able to get what we call a CPT code, which basically is a code that lets radiology centers use the Icometrics test and then bill for it. Super important, because if you can't bill for it, oftentimes centers won't get reimbursed for it, and so then that doesn't help people. So iCometrix is doing really nice work in that area. They have an app called iCompanion, where people with MS can go in, enter their information, and you do lots of data sharing. They use content from the National MS Society as part of that. So again, very nice, very positive that way. One other thing I'll say around AI is through the International Progressive MS Alliance, we funded a project led by Dr. Doug Arnold McGill that really talked about developing an algorithm that could try to predict progression based on MRI. And we've been able to gather MRI images from, I believe we're up to 16 or 17,000 people who participated in clinical trials. So that's thousands and thousands of MRI images that they can then use to train the algorithm to try to spot what might be happening in progressive MS. And what I'd say for your audience, that's really an important aspect of it, is that you've got this research team that has gathered all of these images, but the people who had all those images were the drug companies that did those clinical trials. And the 5 drug companies that are involved in those clinical trials have all shared this data, shared the clinical records of this, and it's an amazing example of how people do share data, and companies, pharmaceutical companies get criticized for a number of things, but one thing I will say is that pharmaceutical companies are actually leading the way in data sharing in a way that really I applaud them for, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of value that they have there that they openly shared for this project to happen.
Thank you for that. And I know that they're involved with the pharmaceuticals. A lot of them are involved with what goes on with iCometrix and with what goes on with Octave now. And so it's good to see that they are involved, because I guess, if one day the biomarkers finally show what a person should be on, what kind of medication would be best for a person, I guess that would be a great thing for the different pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I mean, we need everybody at the table. We're at this place where we need everybody at the table, and so I'm glad that they're doing that. We hold them to account. I mean, I don't want to minimize. I mean, the society's been quite vocal about the cost of medicines and the fact that the cost of medicines in the United States are outpacing the rest of the world, and that creates access challenges that we gotta tackle about. So they know where we stand on that, but I'll also applaud them when they do the right thing with data sharing as well.
Great. Fabulous. So let's talk about going back to the research. If a person is older, 60, 70, 80 years old, how is research on younger people benefiting the older folk that have similar things wrong with them, but they're not getting the same direction, or it's not being applied correctly because they are older?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and a super important question as MS becomes more and more of a manageable disease. I mean, the practicality is that people are getting older, living with MS. That's a really good news story. People are living older to be older with MS, and fantastic. But also, what we don't understand fully is how does MS evolve, change over time? What we do know is that as people get older and older, their immune system becomes less and less sort of robust, which is why as people get older, they're more susceptible to things like infections. They're more susceptible to, getting things like pneumonia, and why older individuals have to really pay attention to things like the flu, respiratory syncytial virus, RSV as we call it, and other COVID as we call it. And that's because the immune system of an older person is not fighting off infections as well as it does. But that's also why, as people get older, their doctors start weighing whether or not they should continue to be on a disease-modifying therapy, because, there's an open question as to whether or not, the immune system of an older person is as angry, as we would call it, in MS. And so there's some important conversation happening about should a person who's over, say, the age of 65 stop a DMT. There's been some research to suggest that stopping a DMT, increases a person's risk a little bit of a relapse if they have it, but it's not a huge amount. So there is an important conversation for people to have with their doctor around that. What we also do know is that as a person gets older, the ability of their body to repair itself gets less and less. This is why when we cut ourselves when we're older, it takes longer for a wound to heal. The same is true with MS lesions. As you get older, your brain's going to heal slower. And the other aspect of the biological aging process, as we call it, is that what we don't know is, how does an older brain respond to the damage that's associated with MS compared to a younger brain? We suspect that the younger brain bounces back faster than the older brain. And so these are all areas of research that are emerging. We're actually actively looking at how we would fund some research to understand what MS in a biologically older population looks like compared to a younger population. Don't have all the answers for that, but we do have clues that age does make a difference.
Thank you for that. You should take a sip of water so we can continue here.
Doing a lot of talking here, but
yes. All right. So a person is asking, how does induration of thymus gland affect MS?
I'm afraid you stumped me on that one.
Well, me too. Sure. I can't read the word. So, all right. I think just in general, is the thymus gland, does that affect MS?
So thymus is where the T cells come from, so that is an important piece. But I think that they get educated in the thymus is what we call it. It's important, but it's not the only actor in MS. So I think that would be what I would offer back to them.
Great, thank you for that. All right, next, can lesions actually heal themselves?
Good question. So the answer is, this is where myelin repair comes into play. There are sometimes doctors will do presentations where they'll show, a brain where there's a very clear lesion, and that very person, 2 months later, you can't see where that lesion was. And that is, it's less about the lesion repairing itself and more that the lesion's a result of, myelin damage happening. It creates a very clear sign that there is damage there. But then if you have, the stem cells that create myelin come back in there, remyelinate the nerve cells, and then, you wouldn't be able to spot that. It is, but the way to think about this is it, I liken the stem cells and their ability to repair themselves in our brain as a bit like a credit line, where early in the disease, the brain can repair itself frequently, and lots of good things happening, but that's a credit line you're drawing on, and that eventually that credit gets exhausted. To repair, and that other things are come into play, and so that's when you start seeing where lesions will remain because there hasn't been enough repair. This is different in different people, and this is one of the puzzles of MS. That some people are able to repair a lot, others aren't, and it could be a variety of factors. But when we talk about natural myelin repair, that's what we're talking about. Is that lesions that were once there are now gone.
Thank you for that. All right, we'll start now. Tone down now. How close are researchers to figuring out how to rebuild the myelin?
So, like I talked about, pretty close. We have clinical trials going on now, looking at whether or not giving people certain treatments can promote myelin repair. One of the strategies people are thinking about is when we should think about giving a myelin repair treatment, because you wouldn't necessarily need to give a myelin repair treatment all the time. You'd want to give it to a person when they have damage to stimulate stem cells to do their work, and then you don't need it again. It's not like a DMT. It would be more acute. The question will be when to give that treatment, how long, and then how you would measure it. But the thing is that there are several companies now working on myelin repair treatments, and I think it's just a matter of time before some of those are successful.
Okay, thank you. Going back to, I hate to jump around, but just have a question arrive. All right. So for a person that has HSCT stem cell treatments, If they're using a walker or a scooter, what what are the odds of them actually being able to walk again?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and honestly, I don't have a good answer for you on that one. The guidelines that the National MS Society provided, along with the bone marrow transplantation um, doctors group, suggested is that an individual, individuals who are the most likely to benefit from HSCT are younger individuals who have very aggressive MS, but who still are what we call ambulatory, able to walk, walk effectively
Right.
without use of an aid, a walker or something else. That the data, both the short-term and the long-term data, suggests that individuals with progressive MS are likely not to benefit as much from HSCT because, HSCT, I'd say, really is about focusing on rebooting the immune aspects of a person's body that might be overactive in MS, less about preventing some of the underlying, what we call neurodegeneration, where the disease mechanisms that are associated with nerve cells dying. And so those are different mechanisms that are not addressed by HSCT. And so, I think in general, we recommend that, it really would be individuals who are, have very active relapsing MS, not responding to any of the treatments, and that they still have a lot of sort of physical activity. It's not to say that a person who is secondary progressive MS may not benefit from that. I'm not a physician, so I don't want to make that kind of a sweeping aim. Our medical advisory committee and the bone marrow transplantation group wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but again, that's a conversation for a person to have with their doctor and the people that matter in their life as they make this decision.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, how close are we to an actual cure?
A good question. So I'm not going to give you a year because I don't know. I don't honestly. I wouldn't predict to you. What I can say to you is that the international community, and when I say international community, I mean the scientific community, people affected by MS, patient organizations, I think are more organized than ever to try to get at a cure. I do think that, we are starting to see signs that we can spot MS earlier and earlier than ever before. And that, if you can identify MS before it becomes MS, you could potentially intervene either with a vaccine strategy of some sort or a drug treatment that that could prevent a person from getting MS. Is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that there are research teams that are looking at, can you spot MS before it shows any clinical signs? What would you need to do that? You know, there are other research teams that are trying to spot who is at risk of developing MS. So, say for example, you live with MS and you have a daughter or son. That daughter or son have a higher risk of developing MS than if you didn't live with MS. And so, if you study these individuals, can you find the risk factors that say what are the odds that these people would develop MS? And by studying those individuals, we can actually identify what's the cause. So, we're also actively looking at, you know, what how viruses like Epstein-Barr virus contribute to the risk of MS, and could we consider a vaccine strategy that could become a preventative strategy for MS? So that's where, I'd say the community is much more organized around this. The MS organizations, as you saw at Pathways, are much more organized around this than we've ever been before to get to that. But I'm afraid if you had said to me, Tim, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? I'd say if it's either, I'd probably be misleading you. So I'm not gonna try to predict when that would be.
Okay, thank you for that. By the way, I think the MS Society is fabulous. Okay, and
Thank you.
there have always been people here and there that always say something about any organization, including MS Views and News, but I just don't listen to that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you. And we also think MS News and Views is great. And look, like any organization, we can always be better. And we love, when people want to let us know where we've let them down, we always try to do better. So we're
right.
open to
But
that as well.
I would like you to thank you for that. I would like you though to now just speak about a few of the things that that the MS Society has that a lot of people don't know about. Can you tell us about Ask an MS Expert?
Sure. Yeah, so Ask an MS Expert, like this show, actually was one that we started in the pandemic because, we couldn't create in-person programming anymore. So, but we leveraged technology and our relationship with our good friend John Strum, who is the host of the Real Talk MS podcast, a terrific show. So if you're into podcasts and you want sort of the latest comings and goings in MS, John's show, the Real Talk MS podcast, is one. Full disclosure, the National MS Society sponsors John's show, but it's John's show. We just help underwrite it. He does the content himself, so we don't have any editorial say over it. But it's a terrific, balanced show. John's wife lived with MS, and he brings a great perspective. So John hosts the Ask an MS Expert. It's a weekly show where we bring on experts to talk about lots of different things, and he interviews people. It's a very practical, educational programming. Things, for example, we've done shows on one of our most popular shows is called Is It MS, where people sometimes have symptoms and they're wondering, do I have MS? Don't I have MS? But he'll interview people. We'll have practical advice. We've done an Ask an MS Expert on Medicare open enrollment, which, for your listeners who might be in the Medicare population, that starts up again on October 15th, and we'll probably do another show around that. It's every Thursday, and it's live. You can sign up to join it live. Like your show here, it's also live streamed on Facebook, I believe on YouTube, and then obviously recorded, so you can see all the past episodes on the National MS Society website. And we'll do general topics, and then we'll do one in Spanish, I think once a month, and then I think once a quarter we also do a show that's focused on veterans. And so it's a great resource, timely resource. We try to give people content that can make a difference in their life.
Thank you. Yes, I was actually a guest on his show during the pandemic, as he was a guest on our show during the pandemic. So it worked out great.
Yeah, John's a great friend, and we really appreciate being able to work with him and really I love championing the great work he does and the great work you do for people to get the content they need.
Right, exactly. And so another thing is, and this is a really good one, talk about the MS Navigator team and what they are doing, please.
Sure. So the MS Navigator team are a group of about 60 or so professionals who are here to support people with MS with whatever the gamut of questions they have. And so we're here, you can call our MS Navigator line. If you give me a second, I can tell you what the number is. It's 1-800-344-4867. We have people available 9 a.m. From I think 9 to 7. And then we also, if members of your show are like me, where I don't want to talk to a human, but I'd rather use my keyboard, my fingers to talk to someone on the keyboards, we also have chat support where people can chat with an MS Navigator. They are here. Navigators are here to help guide people in their journey. If they're new to MS, they can find out information about newly diagnosed. They can find out whether there's a doctor. There are other individuals when people have much more needs, like say for cooling and they need help getting an air conditioner or critical short-term needs. They're able to do a wide range of things and really are here to support persons. They try to solve as many things as they can. They can't solve everything, but we really try to work with people to support them wherever they are in their journey. One thing I'll also say that the Navigators team are also really able to do is we have a team of experts that we call our benefits and employment team. And one of the things that we also know is that trying to get health benefits and understanding your health benefits and what you need to do for insurance appeals and all of that can be complex and complicated. And the BET team, as we call them, are here to support people in all of that, both in terms of health insurance, but also importantly with it, if a person's employed and they're sort of wrestling, when should I disclose? Do I need, what do I need to tell my employer? How do I ask for accommodations? All of that can be really sometimes it can be very isolating if you're trying to navigate through that alone. And the BET team is really equipped to be able to help walk people through that part of their journey. And so definitely, if you're in a job now and you're wondering, when do I tell my employer? How do I ask for an accommodation? Will I get fired? What are my rights? And all of those things, the BET team is here to help.
All right, and one thing that's not on here that I really, really, really know, and I'm part of the movement as well, the MS activists. Right.
Yeah.
This is so important for people to know about because everybody with multiple sclerosis can be involved. So please tell them.
Sure. So advocacy, as you know from my title, is a super important part of what we do at the National MS Society. And we advocate for people both with the federal government, Congress. And so every year we'll bring activists to the public policy conference and we'll go up on Capitol Hill. This year we really, went on the issue of air travel, because if you travel, in an airplane and live with MS and have an assistive device, like say you're in a powered chair and the like, I'm sure your audience knows, they put your chair down in the bottom and you hope that it's still in one piece by the time it gets to you. And that,
we go through this problem all the time. So
exactly. So the challenge. So we actually went and championed, getting air transportation and getting the FAA to do some things differently. We also advocate for what we call a congressionally directed medical research program, which is a special set-aside funding program through the Department of Defense, where we advocate for $20 million for MS research every year through the DoD. And because activists are doing that every year, I think we're at $64 million or something like cumulatively through the CDMRP, which is a big deal. But we also don't just work at the federal level. I mean, a lot of the stuff that affects people with MS happens at the state level. Health insurance is a state level issue, actually. Getting tax credits for home modification, that's a state level issue. That's not a federal issue. And so we also advocate in the states, and we'll do lots of different issues because we have 50 states in the union and of course 50 different legislators to work with. But what I would encourage your audience, that if you're not an activist now, you can sign up to become part of the National MS Society's MS Activist Network. Visit our website, look up the advocacy section, sign up for getting involved, and you'll get alerts, you'll get opportunities to become engaged. We need a movement of activists involved in this, and so if your audience isn't now, sign up. It's really, as you say, we're proud to work with activists both through the National MS Society, but through MS News and Views, the Consortium for MS Centers, and others through the MS Coalition. We also try to, our goal is to raise our voices together, and I think it's really made a difference. I'll point out that what your audience should know is that within the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know was a controversial act that had a lot of stuff in it, no doubt. But within that stuff also was some important provisions for people on Medicare around the deductibles and what we call the smoothing mechanisms that really help people at the beginning of the year. And these aren't going to be implemented until later 2024, 2025, but they are going to have very meaningful impact on the Medicare population that lives with MS. And that was our activists championing that.
Thank you. And so with me being involved with the activist movement, I also take the articles that are sent to me and I do put them up on our site. So it comes out in our newsletter each month as well. And today I received an email with like everything that you just spoke about and more. And so that will all be published in the next coming few days as well. And people can find that on our blog or on our social medias too. One of the things that came up, geez, I forgot what I was just going to ask about or say something about. I forgot it over my head. But it was, oh my gosh. I really wanted to say something about it, but I forgot what it was. All right, never mind. I must be getting late. It must be getting late over here. I've only been up since 4 in the morning. It's okay.
I know the feeling.
Yep. All right. Well, I'll bring it up another time, but I do want to thank you again for being online tonight. I think we've been on with plenty has been said. You've been on for almost an hour and a half, and and literally almost an hour and a half, and that's great. Ton of information has been provided. All right, so Dr. Coetzee, thank you very, very much for taking time away from your family this evening. They can go back to watching Barbie after we get off the line. All right. And
well, no, it's been a pleasure, Stuart. Thank you for the invitation. Always an honor to be with you and your audience. I'm grateful for the great.
We'll see you. We'll see you in another 6 months. How's that?
That sounds good. Okay. Let's get it on the calendar. I'm happy to come back.
Absolutely, absolutely. So good night, everybody, and have a great week.